First time my new CFO used the phrase legacy mindset in a company-wide meeting, I watched 17 people with a combined 400 years of pharmaceutical manufacturing experience go completely still. I'd been in that conference room hundreds of times. I knew which fluorescent light flickered when the HVAC kicked on. I knew the coffee from the left carafe was always burnt because nobody ever cleaned it properly. I'd signed off on batch records in that room at 2 in the morning when a stability study went sideways. I knew this place the way you know your own kitchen, not because you memorized it, but because you've lived in it. His name was Whitfield, mid-30s, MBA from Wharton, previously a financial analyst at a healthcare investment firm. He'd never worked inside a regulated manufacturing facility in his life. I found that out the same week he arrived. He had great hair, though. I'll give him that. My title was Director of Quality Assurance, and I held the role of qualified person for our site, the individual legally designated under FDA regulations as responsible for certifying that every batch of pharmaceutical product leaving our facility met release specifications. In practical terms, that meant my signature was on every certificate of conformance that went out the door. Without my signature, product didn't ship. Without product shipping, we didn't have a business. I've been at Meridian Biosolutions for 11 years. I came up through quality control, spent 3 years as a senior analyst before moving into validation, then took over QA when my predecessor retired. I held certifications in pharmaceutical GMP, FDA quality systems, and I was one of maybe 200 people in the United States with active QP status under our specific manufacturing license scope, biologics fill finish, which is one of the more technically demanding areas in the industry. None of that impressed Whitfield. What impressed Whitfield was a spreadsheet he'd apparently built in his first 2 weeks on the job showing that our quality department was, in his words, carrying significant headcount overhead relative to revenue per employee benchmarks in comparable sectors. I heard about this spreadsheet before I saw it. Our HR director, a woman who'd been at Meridian almost as long as I had, stopped by my office on a Tuesday afternoon and closed the door behind her. That's never a casual gesture. She told me that Whitfield had been in conversations with the CEO about restructuring the quality function. She told me his proposal involved consolidating my role with the regulatory affairs director's role into a single position. She told me that Whitfield had a candidate in mind for the consolidated role. I asked, who? She looked at the window behind me before she answered. His wife's younger sister. Recently finished a master's program in regulatory science. 2 years of experience at a mid-sized generics company in New Jersey. I sat with that for a moment. 2 years of experience. Generics, not biologics. A master's degree in regulatory science, which is a real credential, but which does not qualify someone to hold QP status under a biologics manufacturing license without a specific approval process that takes at minimum 6 to 9 months and requires documented competency assessments. I thanked her for telling me. She nodded and left without saying anything else. We both understood the situation. That evening I went home and had dinner with my wife. She asked how my day was, and I said fine, which was not entirely accurate, but I needed to think before I talked. She's known me for 23 years, and she understood that too. After dinner I sat in the backyard with a glass of iced tea and thought through what I actually knew versus what I suspected, and what the regulatory implications were of what I suspected. The implications were significant. Our facility operated under an FDA biologics license application, a BLA. The BLA listed me by name as the site's designated qualified person. This wasn't a formality. This was a regulatory requirement. Any change to key personnel listed on a BLA requires a prior approval supplement, a PAS, submitted to FDA before the change takes effect. A PAS typically takes 6 to 12 months to review. During that period, the current key personnel designation remains in effect. In plain language, you cannot simply hire someone new and have them take over a QP role. You cannot reassign it during a restructuring. You cannot eliminate the position. You have to tell FDA first. FDA has to agree, and FDA takes their time agreeing. I pulled up our current BLA supplement on my laptop and read through the key personnel section. My name, my credentials, my professional history, all listed exactly as filed. I checked the date of our last supplement amendment. 3 years ago, routine update to a manufacturing process. Then I pulled up our 3 largest customer contracts. The first was a fill-finish services agreement with a large biotech company based in Massachusetts. Contract value, $22 million annually, renewed in rolling 2-year increments. The contract included a quality assurance clause requiring that all batch release activities be conducted by a qualified designee meeting FDA BLA requirements. The second was a government contract, a procurement agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services for pandemic preparedness stockpile products. That contract was $31 million over 3 years, currently in year 2. The government contract had a compliance clause referencing 21 CFR Part 600 and explicitly required that any changes to key quality personnel be reported to the contracting officer within 30 days. The third was a smaller specialty pharma agreement, about $8 million annually. Similar quality requirements. I did the math. Approximately $61 million in active contract value, all of which had provisions tying ongoing compliance to key personnel designations. My key personnel designations specifically. I closed the laptop and finished my iced tea. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because anger would have made me stupid, and I couldn't afford to be stupid. What I felt was something more like clarity, a kind of cold, organized understanding of exactly where things stood and exactly what was going to happen if Whitfield proceeded the way I suspected he intended to proceed. He didn't know what he didn't know. That's the most dangerous kind of person in a regulated industry. The next week, I was called into a meeting with Whitfield and the CEO, a man named Ashby who'd founded the company 15 years earlier and was, in my assessment, a genuinely smart person who had recently started delegating too much to people who told him what he wanted to hear. Ashby was tired. You could see it. The last 2 years had been rough for the industry. Supply chain problems, a failed product launch, pressure from investors who wanted margins to look better before a planned refinancing. Whitfield had arrived speaking the language of efficiency, and Ashby had been receptive. The meeting was framed as a role evolution conversation. Whitfield had a slide deck. He'd printed it out, which told me he'd put real effort into this, which told me it had been in the works longer than I'd realized. The restructuring proposal was mostly as my HR director had described it. My role and the regulatory affairs director's role would be consolidated. The new combined position would have a different title. Chief Compliance and Regulatory Officer. It would report directly to Whitfield. His wife's sister-in-law, he used that term, not sister, I noticed, as if adding a degree of separation made the nepotism more palatable, had been identified as the preferred candidate for the role. He noted her academic qualifications. He noted her regulatory science background. He mentioned she'd worked on ANDA submissions at her previous employer. Ashby was watching me while Whitfield talked. He had the look of a man who had already made the decision and was waiting to see how I'd receive it. I asked one question. I asked whether legal had reviewed the proposal for BLA compliance implications. Whitfield said the legal team had reviewed the restructuring from an employment law standpoint. I said that wasn't what I'd asked. I asked whether anyone had reviewed the proposal against our current FDA biologics license application, specifically the key personnel requirements under 21 CFR Part 601 and the PAS requirements for any changes to designated quality roles. There was a pause. Whitfield said he was confident the transition could be managed appropriately. I said I was sure he was, and I said I'd be happy to put together a regulatory assessment of the proposal for their review before anything was finalized. I said I wanted to make sure everyone had complete information. Ashby said that would be fine. I went back to my office and wrote the most thorough regulatory impact assessment I'd ever written in my career. 14 pages. I cited every relevant section of 21 CFR, our BLA supplement, our customer contract compliance clauses, and the FDA guidance on key personnel changes. I included the estimated timeline for a prior approval supplement review, 6 to 12 months, during which our current designation would need to remain in effect. I included the contractual notification requirements under the HHS government contract. I included a one-page summary at the front written for a non-technical reader. I sent it to Ashby, Whitfield, and our general counsel. Then I called a lawyer I knew who specialized in FDA regulatory matters and pharmaceutical employment, and I had a conversation about my own situation, specifically about what my obligations were as a designated QP if I became aware that the organization intended to make unauthorized changes to my designated status. He told me what I already suspected. My obligation ran to the regulatory framework, not to my employer. If changes were made without proper FDA notification, I had an affirmative duty to protect the integrity of the license. I didn't hear back from Whitfield for 5 days. On the 6th day, Ashby called me directly. He told me the legal team had reviewed my assessment. He told me they were going to take more time with the restructuring proposal. He asked me to keep the conversation confidential. I said, of course. I also said, gently, that I wanted to make sure we were aligned on one thing. If at any point the company made or intended to make changes to the key personnel listed on our BLA without first filing the appropriate supplement with FDA, I would need to document that and report it through the appropriate regulatory channel. Not because I wanted to create problems for anyone, because that was my legal obligation as QP. Ashby said he understood. 4 weeks passed. I heard through the HR director that Whitfield was still pushing the restructuring privately, reframing it as a phased transition that would begin with Whitfield's sister-in-law, joining in an associate role and building toward a formal handover after she'd gained experience. I want to explain something about what a phased transition means when it involves a QP designation under a biologics license. It means nothing. There is no such regulatory category. You are either the designated QP or you are not. You cannot informally transfer the role while keeping the license designation unchanged. You cannot have someone shadow the position while the license still lists someone else. FDA doesn't care about your organizational chart. FDA cares about what's in the BLA. I had a second conversation with my attorney. He confirmed what I already knew. He also told me something I found useful, that if I were terminated, or if my role were materially altered, the appropriate course of action was to formally notify FDA of a change in my ability to fulfill my QP obligations, which would trigger an FDA inquiry into the status of the license. I began updating my resume that same week, not because I was panicking, because I believe in being prepared. The actual confrontation, if you can call it that, happened on a Thursday morning in late October. Whitfield's sister-in-law had started at the company the previous Monday. Her official title was Quality Systems Associate. Within 2 days, she'd been introduced to our largest biotech client as the QA point of contact going forward. I found out about that when the client's quality director emailed me directly to ask whether there had been a change in our QP designation, because they needed to update their vendor qualification files. I went to Ashby's office. I didn't schedule a meeting. I knocked on the open door and asked for 5 minutes. I shared him the email on my phone. He read it twice. I told him that our client had now been told by someone at Meridian that our QP designation had changed. I told him that was factually incorrect. No such change had been made or approved. I told him that our client was now updating their vendor qualification files based on incorrect information, which created a quality system documentation problem for them and a potential audit finding for us. I told him that if this reached our HHS contracting officer, we had a 30-day notification requirement that had effectively already been triggered. Ashby's face went through about 4 different expressions in the time it took me to say all of that. He picked up his phone and called Whitfield. The conversation I heard from Ashby's side of the call was not pleasant. I excused myself and waited in the hallway. Whitfield came to find me 20 minutes later. He wanted to talk about how we could course correct the situation. He asked if I would be willing to stay on in my current role while they worked through the regulatory process properly. I said I would, under 2 conditions. The first was that all changes to my role or designation would go through the proper regulatory process, with legal and myself aligned before any external communications were made. The second was that I would not report to Whitfield. He didn't like the second condition. He said the reporting structure was a business decision. I said that was fine, and I said that my attorney had advised me that in the event my role was materially altered without proper regulatory process, my obligation was to file a notification with FDA. I said I wasn't making a threat, I was explaining a legal reality. He left without agreeing to anything. What happened next took about 3 weeks to fully unfold, which felt like 3 months while I was living through it. Our Massachusetts biotech client, after receiving the conflicting information about our QP status, launched a formal vendor audit. Their quality team requested documentation of our current BLA key personnel listing, all recent supplements, and written confirmation of our designated QP status. When those documents confirmed that no change had been made, that I was still the listed QP, they sent a formal written inquiry to Meridian asking for clarification about why their quality team had been told otherwise. That letter went to Ashby, legal, and our regulatory affairs director. It did not go to Whitfield. Meanwhile, our HHS contracting officer had apparently been copied on some of the client communications. I was never entirely clear on the mechanism, but government clients have ways of staying informed, and had placed a call to our regulatory affairs director asking about personnel changes. Our regulatory affairs director, to her considerable credit, told them the truth. No changes had been filed, no changes had been approved, and the current QP designation remained unchanged. The HHS contracting officer noted that the company had apparently communicated otherwise to a client, and indicated that a compliance review of our contracting status was being initiated. I was in my office when I got the email notification of the compliance review. I read it once, then walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot for a while. I had done everything right. I had documented everything. I had told the truth at every step. I had given Ashby multiple opportunities to pull back. I had not gone to FDA myself. The situation had escalated through entirely natural channels, through normal business relationships and routine audit activity. I hadn't needed to do anything dramatic. That's the thing about regulatory environments that people outside them don't understand. You don't have to engineer a consequence. You just have to not lie, and the system does the rest. The compliance review took 6 weeks. During that period, new business development was essentially frozen. No new client could complete their vendor qualification with a question mark hanging over our QP status. Our existing contracts were not immediately at risk because I was still in my role and nothing had actually changed in terms of regulatory reality. But the uncertainty was enough to put 2 pending contracts on hold. I was told later that those 2 pending contracts represented approximately $19 million in projected revenue over 3 years. Whitfield resigned in the 5th week of the compliance review. I heard from the HR director that his departure was mutually agreed upon. His sister-in-law left the same week. Her quality systems associate role was quietly eliminated. Ashby called me into his office 2 days after Whitfield left. He looked older than he had 4 months earlier. He thanked me for my professionalism throughout the situation. He said he should have paid closer attention. I told him I appreciated that. He asked if I would be willing to take on expanded responsibilities while they searched for a new CFO. He mentioned a title change and a compensation adjustment. The number he mentioned was meaningful, a 20% increase plus expanded equity vesting. I told him I needed a day to think about it. My wife and I talked that night. She'd watched me carry this for 4 months. The careful documentation, the attorney calls, the late evenings reviewing regulatory filings, the discipline of not reacting when everything in me wanted to react. She asked me if I wanted to stay. I thought about that question honestly. 11 years, I knew every process in that facility. I knew every person in the QA department, had mentored half of them. I knew the equipment, the systems, the history of every deviation in CAPA. I knew this place. I told Ashby yes. The new CFO they hired 6 months later had a background in healthcare operations and had spent 3 years as a VP at a contract research organization. On his first day, he asked me for a briefing on our regulatory compliance posture. We spent 2 hours in the conference room, the same one with the flickering fluorescent light, and I walked him through our BLA, our key contracts, our quality management system. At the end of the meeting, he said, "Sounds like this function is genuinely critical infrastructure for the company." I said it was. He nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Some people come into a room and immediately understand what holds the walls up. Whitfield never understood that. He looked at the walls and saw overhead. He never once wondered what they were load-bearing. That's the difference between someone who builds things and someone who optimizes them. And the difference matters most when the building is a regulated pharmaceutical facility and the walls are made of federal licensing requirements. I still have my QP designation. I still sign the batch release certificates. Every product that leaves our facility goes out with my name on it, the same as it did 11 years ago, the same as it did on the day Whitfield walked into that conference room with his slide deck and his benchmarking spreadsheet and his wife's sister-in-law's resume. The certificates look exactly the same as they always did. Some things don't change. Some things are more important than a CFO's organizational chart. I still think about the moment Ashby read that client email on my phone. The way his eyes went across the screen twice. There was no drama in it, no shouting, no confrontation, no movie-style reckoning. Just a man finally seeing, in plain text, the cost of what he'd allowed to happen in his own building. That's usually how these things go, not with a bang, with a document. What Whitfield never understood, what people like Whitfield almost never understand, is that integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a practice. It's the thing you do every single day when nobody is watching, when there's no audience and no applause and no immediate reward. For 11 years, I signed my name to batch release certificates. Every one of those signatures was a statement. I have reviewed this. I stand behind this. This product is what it says it is. You cannot separate that kind of accountability from the person who carries it. You cannot swap it out for someone with fresher credentials and a tidier organizational chart. I made a choice early in this situation to stay in my lane, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that my lane was the right one. I had a legal obligation, a professional obligation, and a personal obligation to the integrity of that license, and those three things pointed in exactly the same direction. When they all align like that, the path is actually simple. It just requires the patience to walk it without flinching. That's the part people underestimate, the patience. It's easy to know what the right thing is, sitting still and doing it quietly for weeks while someone with a slide deck is actively working to dismantle what you spent a decade building. That takes something different. It takes a kind of stubbornness that isn't anger, more like a low, steady refusal to abandon what you know to be true. I think about Whitfield sometimes, not with bitterness, but with something closer to genuine curiosity. He was smart in certain ways. He could read a financial model. He understood leverage and margin and benchmarking. What he couldn't read was a room full of people who knew things he didn't, and more importantly, he wasn't curious enough to find out what those things were. He arrived with his conclusions already formed. That's the most dangerous kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't leave room for what it doesn't know. What saved Meridian, ultimately, wasn't me. It was the fact that reality has its own enforcement mechanisms. The FDA doesn't care about your restructuring timeline. Your client's quality director doesn't care about your CFO's family arrangements. The regulations existed before Whitfield arrived, and they'll exist long after any of us are gone. I just understood them well enough to know that I didn't need to fight. I needed to document, communicate clearly, and let the framework do what frameworks exist to do. My wife asked me once, during the worst weeks of it, whether I was okay. I told her I was, and I meant it. Not because the situation wasn't hard, it was, but because I could look at every decision I'd made and stand behind it. That's a specific kind of peace. It doesn't make the stress go away. It just means the stress doesn't have a shadow attached to it. Ashby thanked me eventually. The new CFO treated the quality function the way it deserved to be treated. The licenses stayed intact. The contracts held. And my name is still on every certificate that goes out the door.